So then I said to Woody Allen, well, Camus can do, but Sartre is smartre.
Boggles the mind, doesn't it?
How's that supposed to make me feel?
Hearing, vision, basic cognition.
I've got about an hour today.
Oh, that's perfect. I didn't want to talk too long either, so that's good. So that, like I said, I just traveled 4,000 miles roughly. Yeah, it was awesome. I had a wonderful time. I would do it again 100 times, 100-fold.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you like weddings? If there's like types of people, I'm a type that really enjoys weddings. I see why it's like celebrated cross-culturally.
I see that too. And I can say that I like two aspects of weddings a lot. One of them is just like the party vibe, just a huge people like sort of being together and there to celebrate something, something that's meant to be sacred, special. And the other aspect is, I guess, like the ritualistic part of it itself. I always try to pay attention to like the things that I don't know the minister, for example, is saying, the priest or whatever. And although it's not something that everybody fully understands, like the meanings that are there, everybody still participates in it as though they understand.
Yeah.
And there's something transpersonal about that experience, which sort of ties you to the past and allows the past to move on into the present or through the present into the future. So I really like that aspect of it. It's interesting. And it makes me feel part of history in a way that,
Yeah, the part of history part, I think, is actually the way you said it is perfect because um, modern the modern psyche doesn't feel like it participates fully in history, but in a meaningful wedding, you can't deny that. It's if there is such a thing as like mundane and elevated reality, where the elevated reality isn't abstract and symbolic fully. It's a very grounded kind of like, wow, this memory, these 12 hours will be in my psyche 100-fold compared to a normal 12 hours. And the other aspect too, the coming together of the community, just the whole like it's a fun party where I was sitting with seven strangers who I knew intimately by the end of the night, and everyone was so outgoing and centered on the whole process that yeah, it's a I wonder what Heidegger would say about something like that because it really does like it's like a ground of time of like human culture is both gathering into and being born out of or springing from this point in space and time about these people. Yeah. And the celebration is so fun because you said ritual. They were doing this, they did this song where I guess in Greek cultures, they throw money in the middle and people were doing that spontaneously. And I was like, oh, what's happening? And two people were telling me all about how important it was and what it used to mean in a different time, and how it used to make a lot of sense. But now it's just more of like a wedding thing that reminds us of weddings.
yeah. Well, that's really interesting because like if I think about it in Heideggerian terms, the sort of question that comes up is like, what's the kind of world that's being gathered and organized through this ritual frame? And it's the kind of world where apparently it's possible to get to know or to have the feeling of getting to know seven strangers very intimately by the end of the night, for example. And it's
Yeah,
the type of thing that when you look back at it, it puts a smile on your face.
of
And
course.
so
Yeah.
there's kind of pleasure
Joy.
there, joy.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Um, so there's a kind of openness to the horizon, actually, that's associated with this world as well, because part of its meaning is that it makes it possible for all sorts of different meanings to be disclosed as you engage with it through memory and conversation like this as well. So maybe weddings are they're the kind of world in some sense that uh, makes possible possibilities of engagement. something like that.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Because it's such an interesting because it's everyone is coming together to celebrate something, right? There's nothing happening. That's what's actually excellent about this type of event, this type of like culture,
Hmm.
is in it, in some sense, only one thing is happening, or kind of nothing is happening. It's not like when you kill a deer, or you like go to the market and trade your chickens for cabbages and stuff like that, or you even exchange gossip. Like you said, there is an opening of possibility, but it's not like small talk where you're like, oh, did you know what the sheriff did? Oh, I heard what the hen raiser did. And
Uh-huh,
there's
uh-huh,
like
uh-huh.
some kind of social value happening. But it's almost like um, anti-nihilistic or something. Like it really like stands in the face of nihilism, I would say. If we're gonna have this Heidegger uh,
Yeah.
Kippian,
Well,
yeah,
and that sort of invokes the question of meaning, actually. And
right. That's what I mean
the,
exactly.
yeah, the analog, I think, is when you're listening to a song, a tune of some sort, a melody, as each note is happening, nothing is really happening. But
Right.
in another sense, something is happening because by the time you reach the end of the melody or the tune, you know what's happened, the song. And
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
like music is such that, right? Um, its structure is temporally extended, which means that the meaning that it holds also only exists as a temporal sort of phenomenon. You look, okay, this is one of my favorite demonstrations. Let's sing Happy Birthday.
Uh-huh.
Happy birthday
Birthday
to
to
you.
you.
Happy
Happy birthday
birthday to
to you.
what happened when I stopped right there?
I
It
don't
was
know.
incomplete. Your mind wants to fill in the rest.
Uh-huh. Well, I understand expectations. Yeah, music is great for uh, setting up conditions where you relax into an expectation or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And the frustration that comes with the interruption,
Uh-huh.
right? The disruption is indicative of the fact that whatever the meaning is of the experience, which is the song, it can only be had once the song has reached its end in some sense.
Hmm.
Otherwise, something's missing, something's lacking. And it's kind of like another analog is a story.
Right.
You,
Yeah, it's the same.
uh-huh. Like if
Adapting some kind of structure for meaning almost. It's really interesting.
yeah, you don't want, I mean, do you always want, maybe sometimes you want a story to end on a cliffhanger, but that's like a particular device that you use as the storyteller, maybe to,
Okay.
invoke curiosity and like engagement, but like stories naturally have an ending. And that's what sort of like brings home the moral of the story. And
Okay.
so when we're talking about the meaning of a wedding, like is it in the vows, for example? Is it in the arrangement of the wedding ceremony, the planning that it takes? Usually people plan for like a year, right? Or is it in the after the wedding, right? The rest of your life portion that gives the wedding its meaning. The meaning of
Right.
the wedding,
Right.
the
It's
marriage is sort of like in all these things together. And that's what the openness of the horizon sort of is.
yeah, 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 of course. Yeah, because it's weird that there is such a thing as like physical change, but humans, if you just said like, I don't change until I physically change or something like that, you would be in this kind of uh meaningless middle world or something where you're like, oh, I feel like things are happening, but there's no physical changes, so it's all mental or something like that. But
Mhm.
when with this gathering together, like you said, all this planning, I'm using all of my attention and my resources and even my social resources and the resources available in my community and stuff like that. All of this um, human attention is being put into something, and that thing that it's being put into, yeah, it's the possibility of like a different horizon opening up or something like that. Yeah, it's great.
Horizons are super interesting because they're it's kind of like light. You don't really see it, but it's the thing that makes sight possible.
Yeah, you can see light technically, to be fair, but yeah,
Technically, yeah.
you're not noticing all the light in the room around you the same way you're
Yeah.
noticing the walls and the surfaces and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Where is this taking us actually in terms of what's our horizon looking like right now in this
Yeah, so I
conversation?
had no
What are you
plans
thinking?
today. I figured it's just been a while, and if you had an idea, I am interested in the question of like, uh, what is an inner life? I think
Hmm.
just as a subject of study or of inquiry that I'm interested in. Yeah.
Hmm. What is an inner life?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, let's spend a moment and see like what are the questions that that question is pregnant with, because that's not a simple question. There's questions nested within
Right.
that
Of
question.
course. Yeah, yeah, of
Uh-huh.
course. I see what you mean. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
I
so
could,
what are some questions that you hear? Yeah.
yeah. I hear like inner as opposed to outer. So like, what's the distinction there? Inside, outside.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, life. What the hell even is that?
yeah.
As opposed to death, or as opposed to non-life, as opposed to. So is that like a distinction between animate versus inanimate orders of existence, for example? So
Okay.
that's question number two. Question number three, what the hell does it even mean or say about someone when they raise that question to begin with? Like
Well,
the
yeah, maybe that speaks of their soul, probably, I would guess.
uh-huh. So what feels most interesting? So the depths, yeah, it speaks to something deep. That's sort of what
Yeah,
this.
if
Mhm.
it's true, if what we're talking about is true, it has to be something that anyone could see or could notice, I think is a way better word than see. So we're trying to talk about something. What is a person's like, what is our inner life? Like, what does it mean to say like every person has an inner life?
That's great. I could here, let's try this and tell me what you think. I've been noticing that there's like a really interesting sort of structure taking place in a metaphorical structure that's sort of built into the following statements. Let me just say them and let's see what happens.
Great.
So here's the phrase. In order to overcome yourself, you've got to understand yourself.
Okay.
And it only hit me once I started to really like think about again the metaphorical structure of this to come over yourself, to
Yeah.
transcend yourself, right?
Yeah, I see
You've
what's
got
that?
to
Yeah.
stand under yourself, understand,
Yeah.
stand under.
You want to know, you want to know thyself, and to overcome yourself, you have to understand yourself or something.
Yep.
There's this dialectic happening in your desire there or something.
Yeah, and the dialectic is sort of like in order to reach to the highest or reach the highest points of your possible existence or reach your highest possibilities, you've got to go straight into the depths of yourself. And so, what does depths even mean in this case?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm wondering too. Yeah,
I, I think it starts with the question, it starts with curiosity. That's sort of what opens up horizons of understanding.
yeah. Curiosity is powerful as a a disposition to approach life with, and say, oh, or a phenomenon. Maybe it's a more distinct unit that we can look at. It's like, oh, here's a phenomenon. Um, do I want absolute certainty? Do I want to ignore it? Oh no, I want to be curious. Maybe I want to have like an openness that's not too attached or something.
That's
That's
great,
yeah,
actually.
yeah.
That's the openness bit I think is super important. And the attachment bit, I don't know if you did that deliberately or not, but um, this does lead back to attachment from the psychological point of view as I see it, because
Oh, sure.
uh, there's this idea in attachment theory that in the absence of security, exploration becomes the unlikely response. And so it's only
Explain that,
possible
yeah.
it's only possible to be open to the unknown, to the strange, to the unfamiliar.
Oh,
If you've
great.
got
Yeah.
if you've got some sense of security either within you that you've internalized or had the opportunity to internalize in your developmental history, or
Right.
structures are in place that afford that sort of opening up to possibilities.
Right. Could you
Mhm.
imagine a therapist you didn't feel safe with, right? You need that as a kind of a primary quality or something of
Yeah.
a therapist. Do you know prospect refuge theory? I bet you do.
No, I don't. What is
You'll
that?
love this. It's an architectural philosophical concept. Prospect and refuge are these two qualities that if you put them into spaces, people and other animals really like spaces that seem to exhibit these as
Mhm.
matching characteristics. So pure prospect would be like walking into a mall where they said you could take anything you want, or if you're or a dating environment where you were accepted and there was anyone loved you without even having to get to know you, right? It's all opportunity. It's all opportunity. Like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? Like they don't fear anything. Who's gonna scare that monster, you know? Um, and then there's refuge is like, oh, there's a wall behind me or in front of me, or a place, a bush I can hide in, or I know I'm in a cave that I've explored the back of it and there's nothing behind me in the cave. There's one hole I have to worry about. So there's this like refuge
Mhm.
existential desire, and there's this like prospect existential desire. And architecture, like open concepts, right? Like our perfect example, or like a stone building with an open window to a waterfall. It's like, how awesome does it feel to have a whole stone building that you're safely inhabiting and the most beautiful, like expansive nature? So
That is, I think, exactly highlighting the dynamic between security and exploration, which is what we were just
yeah,
talking
yeah, right. The
about.
architects, what would Freud say? The poets beat us to it. Maybe the architects also beat us to it.
Apparently, um, it's funny because, like, I don't know, to me, the fact that you see the same dynamic show up in so many different domains, independent of one another, I think speaks to how universal and across the board that dynamic is within human experience itself.
Yeah, even
Now,
animal, I could say. Yeah, I think it even like in the lived experience of beings. Yeah.
like from attachment theory's point of view, um, attachment is it is like an animal thing. It's not a human thing. It's
Hmm.
something that mammals across the board exhibit. It's versions of it is also something that animals outside of the mammalian um, um, world exhibit as well. Like birds, for example, they've got something called imprinting. That's
Hmm.
essentially the bird variant of mammalian attachment. And the basic idea
Right.
there is that when you're born, you're helpless. And what helps to protect you from the elements and from predators and things like that is staying close to your adult caregiver. And proximity is sort of what attachment has evolved to facilitate between caregiver and uh, offspring. So it's just that with human beings, we see that dynamic take place in the most exaggerated and pronounced form because human infants have the longest dependency period in the entire animal
Mhm.
kingdom. So they're the most helpless and most needful of
Yeah.
all, in some sense.
Very insightful that comment you just made because it's the origin of all people is dependence. Every person that you and I will see today, including ourselves, spent like their primary part of their beginning of their life totally externally dependent. Again, this inner life, like what is an inner life? If I'm born in complete external dependence, except for maybe my like raw consciousness, I can somehow pay attention with like wide eyes 24/7 when I'm not sleeping. Other than that one, and maybe a
Mm-hmm.
few other capacities, like you learn motor reflexes rather quickly. But but yeah, it's you're dependent, and so it's like I guess that's where the superego comes in, right? Because you have to actually subsume your personality to your dependence. Otherwise, you actually lose the capacity to grow, and be, or even maybe growing is even idealistic there, right? You just lose the capacity to be in a certain way. So I mean that makes perfect sense why like the persona of the family and then a potential superego structure would be almost universal or universal.
That's interesting because you're sort of like hinting at the sort of invariant structures of human subjectivity
Yeah,
that arise as a result of this dependence that we have, this original helplessness and needfulness and openness.
yeah.
Um, and there's also another point there, I think, to be made that um, look at the evolutionary picture for a moment. Why it is that we ended up having such a long maturational period to begin with. When our ancestors stood upright for the first time and then decided that that's a better way to stand and to be in the world, there was a pressure that emerged to reduce hip width in a like anatomically that makes more sense. If you're going to stand upright, you don't, the wider your hips are, the harder it actually makes being upright. There's a reason for that.
Sure,
um,
yeah.
but
Mechanics are important. Yeah, they're essential,
yeah,
you could say. Yeah.
but what happens as your hips start to narrow? What's going to happen in childbirth? Well, babies are going to have to, their head has to pass through the birthing canal, right? But human heads are big.
Yep.
So what evolution did in order to optimize this trade-off was to find the sweet spot where hips are as narrow as possible and baby heads are as small as possible, so that more often than not, babies and mothers giving birth don't die during the process. How did it make babies' heads smaller? By making them be born prematurely.
Yeah, yeah.
So when when a calf is born, within, I don't know, like an hour or something, it can get up and prance around and like
Yeah, yeah, they're hairy. Yeah, their eyes are moving and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
When a human infant is born, it sort of lacks all of that, and it ends up developing all of that postnatally.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of our development happens outside of the womb, which means that we don't have the templates, the built-in heuristics, um, reflexes, or instincts to make us cope with the world
Well, yeah,
effectively.
and well, the instincts part is interesting, right? Because when you attenuate the formation of instincts, you increase plasticity,
Mm-hmm.
orders of magnitude. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not only this like adaptive to the survival of everybody,
Mm-hmm.
but you're stretching, you're maximizing for plasticity by creating these conditions for the maturation into the adult part of the being, really. Because if you look at like every biological conscious agent, when you go from bugs to whatever to us, they have like a pre-adult, adult, which is the longest, and then a little decline, and then death is like the four steps, like one, two, three, four. So there's, birth, adulthood, decline, death. And so our pre-adulthood is, 9 years or something like that until maybe a kid could be independent the way like a baby sea turtle could find food
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that because they're coming out of the egg into the
Mm-hmm.
Atlantic Ocean or wherever they are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So notice, like, what does that do to our horizon? That
right, of
radical
course. Yeah, that's what I
openness,
mean.
that plasticity.
Right.
And we're back to where we first started, the
Yeah, no
question of the
kidding.
openness of the human horizon. And so
Mhm.
part of what constitutes our inner life is the radical openness of our horizon that we achieved um, by sacrificing instinct and uh, uh,
Yeah.
the otherwise stable and maybe even rigid structures that most other animals have built into them, thanks
Oh,
to
that's
attachment.
that's
Mhm.
really good, Gary. Yeah, because I feel like a little aporia here that looking at like these symbolic events like weddings or psychoanalysis or therapeutic perspectives and stuff as trying to make us more plastic than we otherwise would be as like a kind of species or as an individual, is very interesting. Like as in by plastic, I mean exactly like extending horizons. Because if I'm a fully developed dandelion or sea turtle, my horizons are prefixed once they kind of establish themselves. Other than like if I'm a good fighter, I might get a little more territorial acquisition or something like
Rob, let me ask you something about the claim there. Um, I'm actually wondering that I'm not sure if something like psychoanalysis is trying to make you more plastic.
well, in the broadest sense of from
Because,
a rigid sense, not
yeah, let me tell you my claim, and you tell me if how it fits with what you were saying, because
yeah.
I'm not sure I fully understand, but tell me about the fit. Um, I think that things like psychoanalysis or therapy are trying to make it possible for us to cope more effectively with the problem of plasticity.
Oh,
And
interesting.
what that actually ends up requiring is the exercise and the enactment of plasticity, the internalization of a plastic slash exploratory mode of engagement. And so it's more like you become more plastic as a side effect,
Well,
not as
yeah, yeah,
the aim of what's happening. Because what's happening is, what the hell do I do with all of this
yeah,
that there
yeah.
really aren't any answers for, because that this is the thrownness of my
Right,
existence.
my horizon is here. I can see it. I am it, right? I am my horizon
Mhm.
right now. That's what I mean. And from that horizon, a horizon opens. That's what I meant by plasticity. Is like other than being stuck being a monkey or being a dog or whatever I am,
uh-huh.
there's this whole new reframing is almost like too weak of a word, right? There's this whole new kind of growth. What do they call it? The like discovery and integration. There's all sorts of like both happening. But in
I
that, does that make more sense? Yeah, it sounds like
Yeah,
it does.
it does. Thanks for the clarification. And I would agree that reframing feels a little too weak a word or term to
Right.
use here.
Way more
I
than nine dots going aha or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. It's more like a nine dot problem at the level of existence being solved. And so
Yeah,
John Vervaeke talks about orientation.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I think what ends up happening through development and maturation is the possibilities for orientation are what transform. And as you develop, as you grow, as you mature, you become reoriented toward life in new ways that afford
Yeah.
a better, like, optimal grip across contexts.
Right. Yeah. So I was just imagining the wedding, and it's almost like why it's such a good symbol or idea
Mm.
is that it is two people reorienting, and you use the word towards life, right? It's a living reorientation. It's not like some kind of like death cult or some nonsense.
Amazing.
You're not
Yeah,
just
yeah.
writing, books no one will read or something. And yeah, and there's something that is it's one of the greatest things. It's like something that makes us really part of a living human being. Being a living human being is like the capacity to encounter someone and then orient with them towards like a new life together in the wedding case, but towards anything, towards discovering Australia or curing cancer or whatever it is, being the best sister you could be. I don't know.
So this is interesting because there's a kind of normative question that comes up, which is around, like, what are there are presumably better or worse ways of being oriented. And the reason why these rituals exist is to initiate us into a new mode of orientation that was previously beyond our reach. So
Yeah,
they
yeah,
punctuate a point in our developmental pathway, right? We're entering into the next stage, which is
mm,
a new orientation. And somehow that's presumably meant to give us access to possibilities that wouldn't have been possible prior to
mhm.
that turning point, that pivoting point. And so, like, what makes a certain orientation better than another? That's sort of the, like, overarching question that I'm hearing there. But I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think life is always normative. So I think, yeah, better or worse. And what I was really thinking when you were speaking was someone was talking about how in the realm of a mammalian, but even broader animal, but mammalian a lot mimicry, and you said birds imprint and things like that as well. Within the world of mimicry, people and children will over mimic even when they have conceptual reasons not to mimic. And other primates and other things don't do that as much. So, for example, if you show 10 chimpanzees and 10 3-year-olds a mechanical process to get a reward, a peanut or a piece of candy, and then you show them and they can learn it. They can do the ritual, the mechanical process, and then you show them that like any of the steps, maybe all the steps, but one or even all the steps were unnecessary. They were logically superfluous to the mechanical process of getting the reward. But humans will still do the weird thing because they'll assume there's some like uh, implicit value that essentially another human discovered that is in the process that if they don't mimic it and learn it, internalize it, then
Mm-hmm.
they'd be failing. And so, we'll burn a candle for the dead when we're like 10, even though it makes no sense to us. Or so it's really interesting that people will do such mimicry in the way that we do. Does that
So
relate to you well? I don't know if that
yeah,
was
I love that example. Actually, I'm familiar with it from
yeah.
my studies in developmental psych, um, and it does really raise the question of like going back to the plasticity problem. If
Yeah.
my horizon is so radically open, then what the hell do I do with it or about it? Well, one thing I do is I do what everybody else does because there's some value in that. To reinvent the wheel of radical openness and how to deal with that is perhaps too great a wheel for me to reinvent on my own.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so I think that's where culture comes in. This is Clifford Geertz's argument, by the way.
I know here today.
Uh-huh. The argument was basically that it's culture that comes in to fill the void by compensating
Right.
for the lack of preset reflexes and instincts that we have innately, by allowing us to coordinate behavior at the level of groups and
Right.
shared cultural frames of understanding are
That's great,
part of
Garri.
part of how we solve the problem of this openness of our horizon by
Say that last
merging our
part again.
horizons with those of others.
Yeah, say the last two or three sentences again. So how do we how do we solve this, or what is our response?
So according to Geertz, and I'm sort of using my language here, um, the argument is that it's culture that comes in to fill the void,
That I
right?
get.
This radical openness by allowing us to coordinate our behavior at the level of groups. And
Mm.
that leads to the merging, to the marrying of horizons in some sense between people.
Yeah, yeah, like a shared telos, and yeah,
Yes, a shared telos, a shared world.
yeah, because you can't really have a telos without a shared worldview, right? Rick Ripetti, the Buddhist, or he has a lot of Buddhist influences.
I
Says like
love that.
right view is very important.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yeah. It is
Uh-huh.
weird just to even say that someone's a Buddhist because they don't really have theological doctrine and discourse the way we do in the West. But
Yep, yep, yep,
but
yep.
he loves right view. He's always talking about right view, and I love action. I feel like we live in a world of action most of the time, and I'm trying to situate and figure it out, and hopefully I have an insight or my thinking is good enough. But he says, no, no, it even presupposes that you have to go wait before even all the world of action. Just always worry about right view. Because if you worry about right view all the time, maybe you'll get it. And right view is even better than being good at situational attention.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Okay, so there's an interesting question that comes up there around individual differences, actually.
oh, great.
So
Yeah, yeah. Something like this. Yeah.
let me tell you part two of the Garrett's argument, which is what John and I first advanced in the EB5T article in 2021,
Oh,
and that
cool.
has become a big part, I would say, sort of like cornerstone of the inactivist Big Five theory of personality that I do my work on.
That we seed some of our like view to the group to be able to do group processes, or
It's
subtract.
related. It's
Okay.
related to that, and I'm calling this the master of all trades hypothesis. And it's an idea that I think we've talked about together already, but now I've given it a name because why not? The idea is that individual differences in groups evolved so that people could specialize in their own particular domains or niches and could mitigate each other's drawbacks or weaknesses by being specialists in their own way. So, like, it's the difference between making everyone a generalist, which would sort of suck in some sense. You would lose out on a lot of reward there, uh, versus making people specialists in different areas so that as a group, the group would become a master of all trades. So, the reason why individual differences at the level of personality are adaptive from this point of view, according to this idea. It's that it really increases, it enhances the adaptability of the group as a whole.
Mhm.
You are a knife, I'm a hammer, that person over there is a screwdriver, and together we're like a super Swiss Army knife,
Right,
basically.
right. Yeah, I love the idea of synergy, like mathematical synergy, when you can
Uh-huh.
take two things and put them together and get more than two. And
Uh-huh.
I used to do, like you can tell from my amazing physique, I used to read this ab workout thing, and they would do these sequences of things, and like the sequence, they always emphasize like sequence is so important because they were trying to like overload certain areas
Uh,
at certain points, and then the synergy of it created like a superior program to like,
Interesting.
yeah. So, and it was really like a kind of a cool physiology science system
Mm-hmm.
of like the 70s, I think it came out, or maybe early 80s if it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
then.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Legendary Abs. You could Google it, and it's like again like
Interesting.
70s or 80s. This whole set of books came out, but imprinted in my memory is this idea of synergy, and I love it. It's like, oh, me and Garri can write a paper better than either of us alone. So if we're going to be scientists, our relationship can blossom forth to be a little, romantic, more beautiful fruit than
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
my
Uh-huh.
own tree could in its own, ecology.
Yeah, and the synergy idea, just taking it back to the exchange between you and Rick, the Buddhist. Sorry,
Oh,
that
no, this
imprinted
was good.
on
I'm
me,
glad you
so I'm
kept
gonna.
that thread.
uh,
Yeah, this
um,
individual difference of
yeah,
valuing things. Yeah.
there's adaptive value perhaps in each of those perspectives, such that one is able to give something the other one can't. And
Mhm.
so the meta question of synergy here becomes that of when is it appropriate or effective to make use of one of those perspectives as opposed to the other, and
Oh,
vice versa.
nice. I like that we're up a level looking at
Mhm.
well-fittedness. Yeah, this is good.
And I think that being able to answer that question would give us an orientation, a way of orienting toward that trade-off problem. And
Yeah.
then,
Okay, good. Good. Keep
mhm,
going.
mhm. No, let me pause there. Yep, yep.
No, I think that's good because there's a good paper. I wish I knew memorize the title, but it kind of takes a quadrant approach to spiritual practices and religious groups. And so there are like the highly prescribed top down and the almost like chaotically bottom up. And there's lots of just different differences. And on the surface and even in the depths, they don't look congruous, really, some of these parts of the quadrants. But it's a really interesting framework that is just like, uh, here's a framework, take it or leave it. It's just a perspective, but the framework is kind of cool because it breaks down some of these higher level point of views into like, oh, they're all trying to answer these two or three metaphysical questions, and it seems like they can find these stable points within their different paths, and the
Mhm.
paths don't seem to even necessarily seem congruous at all on a lot of ways. But
So this touches on actually a question around another version of the question of what is an inner world or inner life.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
I'm glad we're kind of dancing around this and going
uh-huh,
into it.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Which is that, and this is an argument that John makes repeatedly, in different situations, different times. But um, what we see as being constitutive of our inner life, inner world,
Yeah.
is the capacity to realize what's relevant. And that necessarily implicates trade-off relationships in
Uh-huh.
how we approach and interact with the world. And so part of what our conversation I think has been elucidating or illustrating is that when you are trying to anything that you're in interaction with or engaged with in your life, there's some sort of trade-off relationship that's at play between um, ways of broaching that problem, and you're more or less tilted in one direction of the trade-off or the other. For example, you could say, when I'm trying to figure out what to do today, do I, how far into the future should I consider the consequences of my actions?
Oh, this is interesting. This is the first time you brought up the future. Yeah, this is great.
Uh-huh.
Now
Even
we're
though,
extending ourselves temporally with an idea of an inner life. An inner life feels like it's supposed to be right here, right now.
mhm,
What you're saying is my inner
out
life
there,
might be actually extending kind of beyond myself, which is how can
yeah,
now we're losing some of the language of inner and outer, which is kind of cool.
yeah, that's great because that's essentially where our phenomenological sort of curiosities are going to lead us into these places where the boundary between inside and outside is no longer quite meaningful. And we know this experientially because like there's a lot of people who really live in the future. They just can't be in the moment.
Is that outside or inside? Where would you say that's
Exactly.
located?
Exactly. In some sense, they're already outside of themselves because they're in the future, and the future technically hasn't happened yet. And yet it's happening for them right now because they're living it in their imagination, and
Right.
they're in their imagination. Because you know that they're not, like, when you're talking to someone and you can tell they're already somewhere else because they're maybe looking away, or you could just tell
Yeah, oh
something
yeah. I mean, I'll
shift.
think about things and go like you kind of pull yourself out of the
Uh-huh.
moment almost and then re-engage with the moment. Yeah.
Absolutely, and this touches back on the radical openness that we were talking about of our horizon, because we could make ourselves present to so many different things that are both there physically, objectively in front of us, and that are not. And so, in some sense, phenomenology and phenomenological philosophy and psychology, just the whole tradition itself, what it helps us to thematize is um, the I guess the phenomenon or the experience of like presence and presencing in some
Mhm.
sense. What do I make myself present to or present for myself? Something that hasn't yet happened, that's a possibility in the future, or something that's more closer to me, right? In the present, or do I make the past present to me by recalling what happened 5 years ago or last night? And so these individual differences, there are individual differences in how often people will be living in the future or the present or the past, for example. And it's
Yeah,
impossible to
Milgram's done
say.
some research on that. Yeah, Stanley
Sorry?
Milgram. Stanley Milgram has done research on temporal orientations and uh, especially with like geniuses and high performers, some of them will be too present oriented that like they disappoint Elon Musk. Like, oh, they could have been so awesome, but they're getting like 200 IQ out of just the present without projecting it way into the future like you'd do if you started a company or wrote a book or something like that. And
Wow.
yeah, and some people like just John when he's always like nostalgia. There are some people that have such a temporal orientation that a lot of their meaning is really coming from their grandparents or their old buddies or their last husband or whatever it is, and so just uh putting shame upon that can be a little misleading when you uh devalue nostalgia, for example, if a person is truly temporally oriented like that. Again, this is kind of Stanley Milgram and other stuff like
I really appreciate you highlighting the risk of like shame here.
oh
And
yeah, right. It's ego. Ego is shame, my friend.
it's
Ivan Illich and I have seen first person things, and the ego is like a shame monster par excellence, I would say.
yeah, it is a question of the ego in some sense. And I think what the ego really cares about is presentation and likability more than anything.
Yeah, it's like
The,
persona
the
in a
ego is
sense.
about image in some sense.
Yeah.
And we're not necessarily using the ego in a technical term here, because but it's a common term that's synonymous with this.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
that's good.
but the because shame is a really tough one, because like there's a cousin of shame and we call it guilt. And sometimes it's
Yeah,
tough to differentiate between the two, but the way
yeah,
I've sort of
humiliation. Yeah,
which one, sorry?
humiliation, shame, guilt. Like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
using feelings in this realm where you want to like
Uh-huh.
kind of rescue healthy shame for a person potentially.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Because like, okay, a few things to note here. Now we're talking about the inner world life stuff,
Sure, yeah.
in a more psychological sense, which is nice. Um, Shame. So guilt is about what you do or what you've done. Guilt and shame is about who you are.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard that distinction. I think we might
Uh-huh.
have even talked about it once before.
Uh,
As a matter of fact.
Possibly. I got this from one of my mentors back in the day, uh, Mark Kunkel from West Georgia, humanistic psychologist.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Now, the opposite of shame, we call that pride. That's interesting to think about, actually. It's the inverse. Okay. Um, and the thing that shame does when it becomes pathological, I think, is that it sort of it erases or it annihilates distinctness or uniqueness or like let's say uniqueness.
What if we
Because if you
said soul right here? What if we said it actually just the word soul instead of whatever you were trying to
oh,
point?
I like that.
Yeah,
Shame risks annihilating soul,
yeah,
one's
let's
soul.
hold that. Yeah.
I really like that, because what if you happen to be like a 200 IQ genius, but you're very present oriented, and then you have a bad exchange or an exchange with someone like Elon Musk, and it's like you don't get the job or whatever, you lose that connection. And
Uh-huh.
how are you left feeling about your own present orientedness, let's say?
Yeah, it's like a shirking, right? I can just feel it
Yeah.
almost just thinking about it and imagining
And
it.
you
It's like a
shrink. The
shrink. Yeah.
world
My
shrinks.
another Buddhist, like he's always saying, like, oh, I'm real contracted after that thing. And I'm like, well, then shake it out, friend. Like you've already understood it to really, really tie it back to where we started. You've conquered it by understanding it if you realize it's a contraction. And
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
if you're
And
already practicing mindfulness, then it's just like one more step out from there.
so I wonder about the mindfulness practice actually there. If there's similarities between that and how we sort of deal with these sorts of feelings of shame in the psychotherapy realm,
Oh yeah, go
where
ahead.
I wonder if it's like this for you. The task isn't to demonstrate that, because look, maybe the 200 IQ genius has gotten rejected for his or her style of present orientedness, not just by Elon Musk, but by like 10
Oh,
other
it's
people.
so subtle. Yeah, yeah. No, I totally buy what you're
So,
saying.
so let's assume that it's been like a pattern that's been
The
repeating
people
for
that
a
give up their
while.
love of art or whatever little precious
Uh-huh.
thing matter to them, yeah. That's one of the best practices is if you are feeling like you've lost some of your vitality, do something that you enjoyed like 10 years ago. Just dive into it for a couple weeks even. You can actually just find that the little dip in sometimes like sparks creativity again, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of that is like cultivating a certain kind of acceptance or openness to
Yeah, yeah,
aspects of
yeah.
your own
It's
self.
weird. Like we're talking about the shame, guilt, whatever's gunking up that relationship to this more fundamental part of personality and
Uh-huh.
their like, operating personality that they really identify with in their life or
Yeah.
whatever.
And like sometimes society really prizes and prioritizes some styles only at the exclusion of others. And
Right.
a lot of people are left feeling ashamed, and like there's this part of them that just isn't good. But the sort of psychoanalytic insight ends up being that whatever it is that you're dealing with, like your symptoms, right, of your suffering, they're not just problems, but in a very paradoxical way, they're a form of problem solving that is meaningful, that just is maybe not matching or finding opportunities for proper expression in the world.
Yeah,
Uh,
looking at your frustrations, your existential frustrations, as like a optimal grip kind of problem, and
yeah.
like, oh, how can I finesse this rather
Mhm.
than be in this kind of disjunct gap that is creating stress or friction or whatever metaphor you want to
I
use.
love this because like what this is making me realize is that by meditating and contemplating the sort of concealed meaning and benefit of your stylistic drawbacks, let's say,
Mm,
as they happen in situations X, Y, and Z, like the Elon Musk situation, let's say, that we were
yeah,
talking about. You get to see what good they can possibly offer, to know when they could be useful and beneficial for
that's
you.
healthy, right? That's a very, yeah, to
And
realize, oh,
so
that's one limit. I get to try again.
exactly.
Yeah,
And the cool thing happening there is that you're cultivating a certain kind of character. And I think so. I hadn't had this thought before, so I'm really excited
great.
about this.
We did it, Gary. Yeah,
It's what if character is the development of optimal orientations toward one's own personality styles?
right. Yeah.
And
100%. Yeah, because if
Mhm.
we make character that kind of a construct or kind of thing, it's diffuse when you look at it within discrete temporal moments of an individual or a group. It's showing up everywhere and nowhere. It's like it's so weird, this idea of character. I can't quite pin it down, but it definitely is there. You can tell someone that has
huh,
character from someone that has no character, don't you think?
uh-huh,
You know?
absolutely. And
Yeah.
saying
And
someone's
so
got a good character versus a good personality, I guess those aren't the same thing, really. And we know
they're
that
close.
intuitively.
Yeah, they interact at pretty, you know, high levels. Yeah, 100%. But character is even more diffuse because you can get a strong sense of a personality from an interaction, and the character is almost like you notice it's second order.
I love this.
Yeah. I think about this stuff more than I should. Yeah, that's so good.
It's
Yeah,
amazing. And that brings us back to the openness of our horizons, because there's this diffuseness to character uh, um, um, as there's also this diffuseness to like the meaning of a wedding, for example.
that's right. Yeah, that's
All
really
these are
why
parallels of the
even
same.
it's ineffable. Even the beauty of a wedding is kind of, you couldn't list it like the same way you could like seven traits of a good dog. You can't do that with a and I love when people try to, especially I noticed without naming names, the bride was like kind of had an inner critique of what could have been different or better or what happened versus the imagined. And I only saw the diffusion of light, right? I only saw the family and the friends and the cathartic turning point towards the new direction that was happening and all this stuff. So, um, yeah, I like how we kind of took my question in our kind of spontaneous conversation and a lot of your interest and my interest, and we kind of got here
Our
somehow.
horizons met and then helped to disclose the latent possibilities within each other.
That could be a good friendship definition. What do you think about that? Are people friends when they meet
Yeah.
horizons and disclose new horizons for each other?
Hey, I'm gonna cite Brent Robbins. He's a humanistic psychologist at
Yeah,
Point Park University. He recently published an article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology on agapic love as the optimal grip of social relations.
that's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And
Yeah.
what it is precisely what you just
Oh, in the
proposed.
Horizon language. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. I look into your horizon and I facilitate a certain kind of contact within your own self, right? Where you get to take all these possibilities and actualize them over
Yeah.
time. And I'm helping you, I'm accompanying you in that process, and it's reciprocal.
Yeah, neoplatonically, right? We're both participating in each other's benefit and moving towards like a higher, I don't use the word order because it brings up like order and chaos, and it's like a higher, more beautiful state or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I love
There's
this horizon language because it really captures space and time in a way that I feel like is culturally a nice fit, though, because we think very the horizon we can visualize. I like that quite a bit.
Yeah, the phenomenologists got a lot of things right, and I like these kinds of conversations and using this sort of language because I do feel like it's got to be popularized a little more, and brought into the realm of psychology and cognitive science. There's a lot of benefit there conceptually and also pragmatically. And also, it's funny.
So then I said to Woody Allen, well, Camus can do, but Sartre is smartre.
Boggles the mind, doesn't it?
How's that supposed to make me feel?
Hearing, vision, basic cognition.